Welcome everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to join by audio, so we're just going to give it a few minutes and then we'll begin. Okay, good morning everybody. I realise that some people are still joining, but we just wanted to welcome you all to today's event, looking at levelling up and equalities. And I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us this morning for what we hope will be a really interesting and stimulating conversation, and a topic that is really at the heart of the current policy debate at the present time. My name is Sarah Longlands and I'm the director of IPPR North. And for us at IPPR North, we are a dedicated think tank for the north of England, and the whole debate on levelling up and how we start to create a better place for people to live regardless of their geography has been at the heart of our work for the last 17 years. And so we're delighted today to be able to host this discussion looking at the levelling up debate, but in the context of equalities, because for us, a strong and effective regional economy has at its heart a commitment to equalities. There is no either or debate for us in this conversation today. So I'm going to hand over with great pleasure to Sinead Rocks, who's going to be chairing this discussion this morning. Another person from Northern Ireland, another woman from Northern Ireland, so you'll hear a very familiar accent. And Sinead is the Managing Director at Channel 4 for the Nations and the Regions. And we're delighted that she's been able to join us this morning to chair this event. So over to you, Sinead.
Thanks, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here. And you're probably thinking, why someone from Channel 4 part of this levelling up discussion? I was when I looked at my diary this morning. But really, I want to tell you a little bit about why this is a subject that we have been thinking an awful lot about over the past 18 months or so. Channel 4 has always been a very London-centric organisation. And about 2 years ago, they made the decision that if they were to be truly more representative of audiences across the UK, they better break out of London and build a presence elsewhere. That's why at the end of 2019, just before lockdown, we established a new national headquarters in Leeds and new offices in Glasgow and in Bristol. And we've set ourselves the target of spending 50% of our budget outside of London by 2023. So we're a very small player in this conversation, but central to all our plans is the notion of levelling up, of providing opportunities for people to join our sector that perhaps wouldn't have had the opportunity to do before. The media has been overly centralised over the past 3 decades, of course, in the Southeast. We also want to try to build the independent production sector outside of London and provide more opportunities for money to be spent in the nations and regions. Channel 4 is a publicly owned but commercially funded organisation, and we were set up in the 80s to bolster the creative sector and to provide the opportunity for independent production companies right across the UK to make programmes for us. We don't make anything ourselves. So we've set ourselves ambitious targets, and it's in our interests that this notion of levelling up does start to bring real results to the north of England in particular. We've got a vested interest in trying to lend our voice to that. I think we can play a role in shining a spotlight on other parts of the UK to help in the argument. But essentially, I'm here today as ringmaster and chairperson because you're going to hear from people with a much finer eye on detail when it comes to this important conversation. I'm going to introduce you to them in just a second. Just a couple of housekeeping notes first. We've got a stenographer, Eilish, who's captioning the event for us today. There will be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions of our distinguished panel. We will come to that shortly. But what I want to do is introduce you in the first instance to Mayor Jamie Driscoll from the North of Tyne Combined Authority. We're also joined by Joe Lappin, who's the CEO for Cumbria Local Enterprise Partnership. We've got Caroline Waters, the Deputy Chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And we've got Amreen Qureshi, who's a researcher for the Institute for Public Policy Research North. So I think you'll agree that we've got quite a lot of bases covered there. I'm going to pose a couple of questions, and then I'm going to hand to each of our speakers in turn to get their insights, thoughts and reflections. But what struck me preparing for this session today was pre-pandemic, there was an awful lot of talk about levelling up, but some concerns started to bubble up about a lack of clarity as to what that phrase actually means, and a worry that it was in danger really of becoming a bit of a nebulous political catchphrase. So what I'd really love our speakers to do in their session is tell us what levelling up needs to mean from their point of view and how we're ever going to achieve it. I'd love to go to Jamie, you first, if that's okay.
Thanks, Sinead. Very interesting you're talking about Channel 4 being there. Last year's budget, I was invited on Newsnight to talk about levelling up from the north. It was going to be from the BBC studios in Newcastle. At 8 o'clock, I got a call saying, actually, we're going to do it in the studio with people from London. So we're talking about levelling up with people in London. And I think that sums up a lot of it. You can't level up with concrete. I'm not going to list a lot of stats about how great a deprivation is in parts of the north. I think everyone on this call knows that. But I do want to say levelling up is not about life chances. I don't believe in social mobility. That is a phrase that implies that it's okay to have areas of deprivation as long as a few people can escape. It speaks to this narrative of the deserving and the undeserving poor. It doesn't take into account, well, what if you grew up with a parent who was in prison? What if you grew up with parents that were divorced? What if you grew up just in, you know, a really poor house and you had a massive long box? All of these things. It's a Dickensian idea that people are supposed to somehow, regardless of their personal circumstances, be able to defy social psychology and escape. It's a brave new world with a quota system. North of Tyne, we're starting a Poverty Truth Commission. And this looks at the intersectionality of poverty, because if you are a woman, there's one more barrier in the way. If you are not white, there's one more barrier in the way. If you've come from a family that's had been separated, there is another barrier in your way. If you come from a working class background with poverty, there is another barrier in your way. So it's about making sure that there's nothing about us without us. Now, investment is a key part of this, it's true, and it underpays it. In the Northeast, we, for 100 years before 1980, we had a GDP of around 93% of the national average, and it's gone down and down and down, and we're now at 73%. It's about wealth generation here, not just investment. There's a democratic deficit. In those last 40 years, when our GDP per capita has been plummeting, there have been 51 schemes and projects, all Whitehall designed, to boost local GDP. And they've all failed. We now have mayoral combined authorities here. And the time cycle about decisions is you have something with democratic legitimacy who can get things out there, get them done. So let's use them. And there may be other models out there, but this one works. So let's just use it and crack on with it. And that means fiscal devolution. Not the power to put more taxes on people, but wealth generating powers, like the power to borrow for a regional wealth fund, like land value uplift, so that we can generate the cash to put our own infrastructure projects into place. It means long-term thinking on prevention, so that we're doing something to prevent the obesity time bomb. If we can put into public accounting things like, well, hang on, transport as a health benefit, then we can afford it, it turns out. And we've got to break down all these Whitehall silos. Now, we'll only know that we've truly closed this democratic deficit when a mayor successfully implements a programme that Whitehall didn't want. That's when we'll know we've got levelling up democratically. The task I've got with a combined authority is to create 10,000 jobs over 30 years. Obviously, I won't be there in 30 years' time. But I've been there 20 months, should by now have created 583 jobs. We've got on target for 3,194 and another 2,114 safeguarded. So we've smashed that target out of the park. Investment works. But it's like bailing out the Titanic with a bucket. We've got an economic plan we submitted to the government to create 55,000 jobs. And the key point is our good work pledge is embedded in every contract. This has 5 pillars: health and well-being, especially mental health, a balanced workforce, including progression, so people get training, value and rewarding work, so that it means an end-to-end secure contracts and paying the real living wage, genuine communication and representation, so that includes trade unions. Trade unionized workplaces are more productive, and it means demonstrating social responsibility. Now, why would any employer not want to do that? We developed this with the business community, where we've got Kickstarters in place. We've worked with employers to make sure that they're getting the real living wage. And as an authority, we're leading from the front. We don't have unpaid internships. We have we're a real living wage employer, and we have a gender pay gap of 0. So this is really a gold standard. And this speaks to this pernicious phrase of the flexible labour market. Now, I'm actually a big fan of yoga, but what we're talking about, that phrase, flexible labour market, it's another word for disposable people. When we look at the Green New Deal, and when we in fact look at the New Deal in the 30s in America, FDR's New Deal, half of it was public works, but the other half was legislation. They strengthened trade union legislation. They put in the Glass-Steagall Acts to prevent the rampant financial speculation, and we need that. So it's not just voluntary to have good work, it should be mandatory to look after your workforce. Finally, just to say, levelling up is about outcomes. We have a destructive habit of making the measurable important with league tables. What we need to do instead is make the important measurable. That means a well-being economy. We will have levelled up when everybody has a home that they can afford to heat, that everybody has a job that they can pay their bills without getting into debt, where we're on top of preventable conditions like obesity, like the mental health crisis, where whole swathes of people aren't left behind, but included in economic and civil and social life on their terms and not some arbitrary definition of Britishness, where people have skills, but not just for work, but for life fulfillment, and places where our kids can meet and play and learn, and where we all have a future because we've reversed our slide into a climate catastrophe. Levelling up means a zero carbon, zero poverty northeast.
Thanks, Jamie. Let's go to Joe next. Joe, you're CEO of Cumbria LEP. Can you hear us, Joe? I think we're having some technical problems there. Caroline, would you mind if I came to you next? You're representing the Equality and Human Rights Commission, so we'll no doubt have plenty to say on this topic.
Thank you, Sinead. Good morning, everybody. The Commission's job is to help make Britain fairer, of course, and to promote, uphold and enforce the equality and human rights ideals and laws that protect us all. And the real key there is all. Evidence tells us that societies that reduce inequalities, they're healthier, they're more productive, they're more cohesive. So it's crucial that fairness is right at the heart of making levelling up a reality. And we've always known that there are inequities in our society, but the pandemic has brought those inequities into really stark relief. But they're not just statistics, they represent real people, people who've lost their jobs, their homes, and even their lives. And since the pandemic, we've witnessed mortality rates in England's most deprived areas double those in the least deprived. So what we are saying here is economic deprivation costs lives. Disabled people and certain ethnic minority groups have faced the dual increased risk of mortality and a higher likelihood of experiencing financial hardship as a direct result of the pandemic. For many people living in England today, life doesn't feel fair at all. Some will suggest that levelling up will be achieved by increasing productivity in certain regions, in building new infrastructure, in left behind towns, or maybe just in moving government departments out of London. Now, whilst those are all important factors, there is no guarantee that will lead to a fairer or a more balanced country, or that those individuals and communities who are already suffering the impacts of socioeconomic disadvantage will be the ones that benefit. It hasn't worked before. Why would we assume it will work now? For too long, we've believed that we can either address inequality experienced by people with certain protected characteristics, for example, women, or we can address regional or socioeconomic inequality. But inconveniently, the truth is that the barriers and opportunities that our people are living with on a daily basis are influenced by both sets of factors. The EHRC's most recent report, Is England Fairer?, shows that while people from some protected characteristic groups experience significant inequalities, these are exacerbated in regions where there is more deprivation. For example, in the northeast and the northwest, areas where high levels of deprivation exist, ethnic minority groups have higher rates of poverty than ethnic minority people across England in general. There is no doubt that if you're disabled, a woman, or from an ethnic minority background and live in England, you're more likely to be poor. You're also more likely to live in poverty if you live in certain towns and cities. And let's face it, being statistically less likely to be poor if you're white, able-bodied and male doesn't make any difference to the dad in Blackpool who's visiting a food bank to feed his family. Neither are the impacts of social deprivation felt equally by all communities. While socioeconomic deprivation is linked generally to worse educational outcomes, of all the children on free school meals, white boys achieve the lowest grades at GCSE. And children and young people in London and the South East have higher attainment rates than those in the North. It's only by understanding and addressing these kinds of disparities, both between and within regions and between different protected characteristic groups, that we can truly start to level up. Tools such as the public sector equality duty and the socio-economic duty are available to leaders and policymakers precisely to help them put equality at the heart of decision making. The PSED aims to make sure public authorities think about things like discrimination and the needs of people with protected characteristics when they make decisions and how they provide services and implement policies. Our research has found too many public bodies focus on internal activity rather than addressing the most pressing inequalities across their remit. Targeting those entrenched issues could lead to lasting progress, and yet we're still looking internally. The socio-economic duty is part of the Equality Act, but it has never been enacted in England. But it has such potential that lots of local and combined authorities are choosing to adopt it voluntarily. Implementing the duty could help reduce the most pressing inequalities of outcome. The socio-economic duty will help organisations ensure that their decision-making takes full account of socio-economic disadvantage. And that means we're putting all of that thought in the right place at the point where we're making the decisions that affect thousands of people. So if levelling up is to shift from rhetoric to reality, both of those tools should be used to drive real local accountability and give you an opportunity to really hold local leaders to account. A human rights framework where decisions are made to balance the rights of different groups can also support organisations to make fair decisions in complex areas such as health, education and the workplace. Using those frameworks can improve standards and deliver real change for people no matter their location or background. And when it comes to investment, something Jamie mentioned, designing inclusive approaches with procurement can make a real difference to how government spending benefits people in local communities. Recent changes to the Treasury Green Book are a welcome shift away from an overly narrow focus on economic benefits. And evidence, including on the legacy of the London 2012 Olympics, shows that if you include equality requirements in strategic investment frameworks, you can deliver results and you can ensure that there's a lasting legacy of real benefit for local communities. Success in levelling up should be demonstrated not just by increased productivity or decreased unemployment, but also by narrowing gaps in attainment, health and well-being. So we've developed a measurement framework which enables us to systematically monitor and evaluate progress on equality and human rights. The government must set out a clear vision for what success in levelling up looks like. And it needs to be underpinned by equally clear and measurable outcome-based objectives. These measures have to go beyond increased productivity or new infrastructure. What really matters is whether people experience better, fairer lives. It's only by addressing these regional inequalities and by addressing the persistent legacy of discrimination and reduced opportunities for certain groups that we will truly level up and make this country fairer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Caroline. Very powerful stuff. Joe, I think you were back with us. Can we go to you next?
Sinead, apologies, technical glitch, but wonderful to hear what Caroline had to say in advance of when I was expecting to. So for colleagues that aren't familiar with LEPS, we are absolutely apolitical bodies responsible to government for economic strategy, investment, coordination and advocacy in our geography. And the apolitical is very important in terms of everything that we do. And you asked the question, Sinead, what does levelling up mean? Quite simply, for us, it means that nobody should be left behind by virtue of where they live or because of any protected characteristics that they might have. And before the phrase was even in use, we were talking very much in all of our economic strategies about inclusive growth, which was really the same thing. It's one of the 3 touchstones in every document alongside productivity and net zero. And for me personally, it's even more simplistic. It's about fairness and equity. How do we treat everybody with absolute fairness and respect? I also think we need to recognise that the concept of levelling up is changing. Geographies that weren't on the radar now are. And if I look to my own geography in Cumbria, South Lakeland wouldn't have been on anyone's radar. During the pandemic, it's had a massive increase in unemployment from a very low base, and it's currently got, excuse me, the highest level of furlough in the country. This was a geography that wouldn't have blipped previously. So the concept and the issues are moving very quickly as a result of the pandemic. Caroline's already picked up on the Green Book, and I totally agree that we need a methodology to be able to do this. In the LEPS response to the Treasury's consultation on the Green Book, we were really, really clear that we needed metrics to assess the success of the policy and appropriate targets to be set. If we're not clear about what we want to do, we're never going to be clear that we've actually got there. Government's already started to introduce some of the mechanisms to deliver the levelling up ambition. We've got the Levelling Up Fund, we've got the Community Renewal Fund. However, the scale of the challenge is way beyond the scope of these 2 programmes, which in public expenditure terms, whilst very welcome, are actually too bob and a conker. We're talking just over £1 billion for the whole of the UK. That isn't going to buy very much at all. And I don't think it's entirely government's responsibility. It's actually everybody's responsibility. What actions can each of us take in the way that we deliver our business to help deliver this ambition? And personally, I believe working across the public, private sectors, adopting an evidential, strategic and integrated approach, we really can move forward. We also need to be really systemic in our approach to place. How does every aspect of policy and investment deliver fairer outcomes for everybody? It does need local leadership to coordinate all relevant parties to pool talent, energy and resource. Are we really clear about the key issues in each of our geographies? And have we got plans in place that will deliver real and lasting change? I'm not going to talk about the role of mayors. Jamie can do that hugely eloquently himself. But irrespective of whether a place has got a mayor or not, what's inarguable is that every area needs strong local and strategic leadership. We need to catalyse local collaborative leadership and get everybody to rethink the way they deliver their own agenda and to consider how this can be delivered differently by working collaboratively with others. I also want to pick up on the really important role that business can play. Working closely with businesses, we can harness their expertise to deliver tangible outcomes in the communities in which their businesses sit. I've seen this through the business leadership on my own board, members taking a genuine and real interest in inclusive growth agenda and looking at how our activities can support delivering this, through business leaders chairing Towns Board and through their own individual businesses in the way they recruit, procure and deliver the business. And I'd like to extend on Caroline's point about cabinet notices. For me, businesses have got a really important job, not those that are publicly funded, but every businesses. And the ones that I speak to, the best businesses, are approaching this in both an altruistic and a very pragmatic way. It's not only the right thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do for my business. It will help me to attract talent. It will buy in a way that's more cost effective, and it will also strengthen the resilience of my business by creating a more localized supply chain. This really matters given the spending power of the private sector, which will dwarf that of the public sector. So there's a huge resource that needs to be harnessed. And clearly equality is essential for economic and social recovery, as without this, it will be very difficult to make recovery happen. We need to bring our young people into the workforce. We need to get those that have sadly lost their jobs back into work. There's currently over 2 million people who've not been to work for 6 months. That is a really, really concerning statistic. And we need to support our businesses to recover and grow, because it's actually our businesses that create wealth and sustainable employment. And without our business community functioning, we're not going to be able to recover, because they will actually finance the levelling up agenda. And final thought from me, Sinead, equality is just good business sense. Everybody being engaged in a positive and productive way creates a happier, healthier and wealthier society. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Very pleased we got your tech back online, and thank you for that contribution. Our final panelist, just to give the initial reflections on this topic, is Amreen. Amreen, can we go to you next?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. A lot of things that I'm going to say have already been said by a lot of our panelists, but today I want to focus on how we can level up for people by empowering them. So when we talk about the phrase levelling up, it's been floating around for about 2 years now, but in policy terms, it's been a slow and opaque agenda. And in fact, for many of us, it's been a struggle to really understand what it should mean. So in my comments today, I'm going to talk you through where levelling up is at right now, what it means for people in regions like the North, and how the agenda needs to evolve to really make a difference. So where is levelling up at right now? The government's most recent iteration of the meaning of levelling up was described in its recently published Plan for Growth. And in that Plan for Growth, it says that levelling up means economic, social and cultural regeneration of struggling towns, boosting growth in regional cities, and changing the way that the government delivers for places. And all of this sounds really promising and positive, but if you look closely at the Levelling Up Fund, there are problems. There's a £4.8 billion pot of money that's been managed by the Treasury, by MHCLG, the Department for Transport, and it's available for local authorities to bid on to get funding for it. And the government has also given local areas rankings between 1 and 3, depending on who they think should be prioritised for the money. Now, as some other panellists have already said, the Levelling Up Fund is not enough. And it definitely shouldn't involve overstretched local authorities needing to pull together bids for competitive and insufficient pots of money. And it certainly shouldn't be dictated from Westminster as well. So the way that levelling up has been set up in the Plan for Growth, it doesn't really scale up to the challenges that we have before us, especially as we face a historic economic downturn as we try to recover from the pandemic. So what should levelling up mean for people? What does it mean to those that have to learn to live, work and survive within political, social and economic structures that just do not favour them? Our research has shown that after a year of a pandemic and a decade of austerity, inequalities have just widened. So in our research, we found that the gender and ethnicity pay gap in the North is wider than anywhere else in the UK. Right now, 40% of women in the North are paid less than the real living wage. As Caroline has mentioned, analysis from the EHRC has also indicated that some ethnic minority groups and disabled people have been among the worst affected by the pandemic, and they're also at greater risk of future unemployment than other groups. And from a young person's perspective, our research has shown that child poverty rates in the North are the highest than anywhere in the UK. Right now, there's 1 in 3 Northern children that are currently living in poverty. So we can't really level up or build back better from the pandemic if the foundations that we seek to build upon perpetuate inequalities. So we really do need to acknowledge that there are deep, serious structural factors that mean that there are groups of people like women, like communities that experience racial inequalities, who experience the opposite of levelling up. Their opportunities are actually being levelled down. So how should the levelling up agenda evolve for people and work for people? In our recent IPPR North State of the North report, we introduced 4 tests to test levelling up. So in our report, we state that progress will be made when all people are able to experience, number 1, a fairer North, number 2, better health, work and pay, a jobs-led recovery, and the final test focuses on an empowered North. I do recommend that everyone check out our report. I won't go into all the tests in detail, but I do want to focus on the final test, where we say that the North needs to be empowered, and that's through better democratic participation, representation, and trust in local and national decision making. Because to tackle inequalities in our society, we need to really give power and agency to the people who are too often unheard. Right now, for example, in the North, all of the Metro Mayors in the North are white men. Hopefully this will change with the West Yorkshire Metro Mayor elections coming up. But in addition to that, the representation of women, of people of colour, of people that are disabled, it's seriously lacking in a number of councils across the North. So levelling up really needs to start with the acknowledgement that there should be a widespread sense among our communities that they can participate meaningfully in decisions that affect their lives and their regions. So ultimately, the way that I view levelling up is through the lens of power. If you shut out of power, then you shut out of the benefits of the government's levelling up agenda. So levelling up won't actually be felt by all people if we don't see an ambitious effort to dismantle this systemic inequalities in our society. We need to also strengthen our democracy by including everyone's voices when considering how we can recover from the pandemic. And when we talk about the plan for recovery, that means putting women at the centre of the recovery plan. That means putting people who experience racial inequalities at the centre of the recovery plan. And that means placing people who have traditionally been at a socioeconomic disadvantage at the centre of the recovery plan. And that's when we'll truly see levelling up in the North. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's the initial thoughts from all our panelists. Don't forget, you can ask questions of them, and we'll go to questions very soon in the Q&A section at the bottom bar on your Zoom, and you can tweet using hashtag IPPR webinar. I want to pick up on a point. There's not masses of disagreement here, let's say that first and foremost, but I want to pick up on a point that Anne-Marie made most recently, when you talked about the plan for growth from the government not scaling up. And actually, the point has been reflected through an awful lot of the speakers, and it's about that potential tension between increased centralisation and control in Whitehall and devolution and local leadership, and how that is going to balance out in order to deliver real outcomes and results. Tom has sent in a question that is very relevant to this. He wants to know, how can we ensure that areas in need of levelling up work together on common challenges? He has got concerns over how central government could allocate funding and potentially doing that on a competitive basis where you've got one region pitted against another. Someone described it to me last week as filling out forms in triplicate for a very small pot of money. Jamie, can I go to you on this?
Yeah, thanks, Sinead. I think the point is well made, that the approach of competitive, well, let's look at an example, the Transforming Cities Fund as it came out. It was announced. And then there was a wait for documentation. Then you had to put in an expression for interest. Then you had to work up a business case. Then you had to put it in. And then you'd find out if you had it. And then when you get it, you've got to spend it all really quickly. There is no possibility for strategic thinking there. You can't even necessarily keep the teams on who are building up these bids unless you win. So then a crisis comes along, the government says, give us your shovel-ready schemes. And you say, we haven't got any because we haven't got the money to employ the people to develop these. That's why you need long-term strategic funding. Now, anyone who ran a corporation would get this. This is not radical socialist policy, this is basic sensible management, is if you don't know what your budget is, you cannot plan for the future. We look at mayoral combined authorities. We didn't know that we were going to get brownfield housing money when we got it in July. We were given it. And this was to clear sites to enable housing to come forward. We've worked with our local authorities, our registered providers. We've had that cleared. In 6 months, we had spades in the ground and it happening. Compare that with the time it takes to get things through national government. You know, the Kickstart scheme was announced at the same time, and there's a handful around the country. I think we're one of the few people who've actually got any delivered. So that's what we need to do, is to make sure you have long-term strategic funding. Then we can start to tie things in, because the whole point of what we're talking about today is the equalities side of it. How can you plan that if you can't link health and education and local business development and everything else with transport, for example, or with education and those other things? That's why you absolutely need local planning on the level of the functional economic area where most people are traveling within the intra-city areas. And yes, rural areas face different challenges, and I represent both, so I know that all too well. That's got to be the approach: stable long-term funding. And I don't understand why it's not obvious to central government. Well, I do understand. If your job depends on not understanding something, you're going to find it hard to understand.
Joe, can you come in on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably spend too much time thinking about relatively small pots of money and not enough time on thinking about the massive amounts of money that currently are in different areas. So to add to what Jamie said, rather than worrying about, you know, I've talked about the 2 pots that have been announced for this or the next financial year. They're less than the settlement that government makes to one of our businesses to deliver its activity in a year, a publicly funded business. So that's the sort of quantum that we're talking. And for me, I'm sorry, excuse my croakiness today, but for me, the bigger issue is, how do we take all of the money that's currently in the system and rethink the way that it works and the way that it's spent to deliver different outcomes? We spend too much time talking about discretionary bidding pots and not enough time about the fundamentals of how do we spend the existing billions that are invested in the public sector. Several years ago, I was involved in one of the, nobody will remember this, whole place community budget pilots. And what they were looking at was transforming public services in the interests of the citizen. How do we make more efficient, effective, public responsive services? That was a really, really interesting testbed that demonstrated you could, by knitting the public sector together better, deliver far better outcomes. There were 4 pilots. One of them was Greater Manchester, and the other in the north was Cheshire West. They did some really brilliant work. The only thing that was scaled up was the integration of public health and social care. Beyond that, not very much else. And I just think we've got to go back to some of those experiences and say, how do we take them forward in the levelling up agenda? Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Jamie mentioned the need to make a further balance between sort of the more metropolitan areas versus the more rural areas, and that's something that Chris has asked in the audience today. Chris wants to know, how do you not recreate further inequality within your own regions by focusing more on the bright lights of the cities versus the towns and the villages? Caroline, do you have a view on that? How do we not create another layer of inequality?
Yeah, and the problem is that it's not like we're creating another layer, it's already there. So this is about really understanding what those are and starting to remove them. So in any strategy, you know, as both Joe and Jamie have talked about, the resources that are available have to reach out to everybody, because we won't do this by just centering in on the easy wins. Obviously, that's part of it, but we have to look at the whole region and think about what's going to make a difference. Now, in the past, what we've tended to think is that it's for rural areas, it's all about transport. We just make transport better and everything will be fine. That's not the case. So where is the innovation? Where are the voices of those people living in rural areas? You know, what are the answers? Most people that I've spoken to tell me it's about funding enterprise, funding businesses that are very, very local. They may be micro businesses, but if they provide in particular local services, and therefore you're building a rural economy, then that is the right way. And I think that absolutely fits in with the point Jamie was making about we have to take a longer term, more strategic view to these things, that often it is about creation, but it's also really about understanding what the problem is. And we aren't very good at that when it comes to rural areas.
There was a very positive reaction from the attendees, Jamie, when you talked about the intersectionality of poverty. And actually everyone has kind of made that point in one way or another. It's not the either or, it's the holistic that needs to be tackled. But there are concerns from some of our attendees that the pandemic is going to make that even harder. So Culla has said, as the impact of COVID threatens to send women's social and economic health back to the 1950s, how can we make sure that investment isn't just focused on big infrastructure projects, but supports, for example, better childcare and social care? So all those other building blocks that you talked about. Jamie, can you pick up on that for me?
Certainly, thanks. Yeah, you can't level up with concrete, I think is the way I phrase it. And it kind of sums it up. It's people's, we need to measure well-being and stop measuring GDP, because GDP has risen over the past 10, 11 years by about 50%. I can't remember the figures, but I know in that time, knife crime shot up, homelessness shot up by 169%, and food bank use by around 3,000%. So just measuring GDP doesn't fix it. It's about where the money's going, what it's being spent on, which very much Joe's point, you know, we spend billions on things. Why are we spending all of our money treating symptoms rather than preventing problems? All of these things need to happen, and that is actually where we start to really address the intersectionality and the very fact that, you know, it is inevitably a lot to do with social stereotypes and social acceptance of traditional stereotypes. It's the women who are doing the homeschooling. It's the women now who are tending to do more of the cooking when everybody's in at home. Now that's a long-term thing that needs to be filled by education, by setting a good example. But when it comes to investment, we also need to remove those pressures to do that. And that is where, when we start to measure things, we should be measuring a wellbeing economy, and we should be measuring the differences between people across those intersectionalities.
Anne-Marie, are we worrying too much here? Do you think the pandemic has set us further back on the levelling up agenda?
Yeah, it definitely has. Obviously, everyone across the world has seen that how the pandemic has created inequalities, how it's caused so much suffering and misery, and it has set us back. But we had inequalities existing in our regions before the pandemic, and they've just been further compounded as a result of the pandemic. We had racial inequalities, we had wealth inequalities, regional inequalities, all of those existed beforehand. So that's why in my opening remarks, I was saying that you can't level up if the structures that you're trying to level up on are already unequal. And those inequalities have widened and worsened during the pandemic. So it's really important that if any levelling up does happen, it does look at the inequalities as well and address them. It's not just about throwing pots of money at local authorities or getting them to bid for pots of money. It's about really looking at the systemic issues that exist within our society. And when you address that, not only do you recover from the pandemic, you also have sustainable empowerment for people that have too often been looked over when it comes to economic plans, when it comes to any type of recovery plan. And yeah, that's it.
And that makes a lot of sense. And earlier you talked also, Anne-Marie, about the need to get more people to participate, to get that representation, so that we are getting that plurality of voice and more people feel they've got a say that influences things. Vicky picks up on that with her question. She wants to know, and Joe, I'm going to ask you for your view on this. How can we ensure that devolving downwards actually does put power in the hands of the people rather than just in the hands of a group of regional mayors. No offence, Jamie, who as current might be well-meaning, but where there are few democratic safeguards. Have you got a view on that?
Yeah, for me, I think that the solution to very complex problems and issues is actually about collaborative leadership. So yes, mayors can play a really big role in bringing people together, but if you want to change things and transform things, you need everybody engaged, because you need their intellect, their spending power, their policies, their programs working together to deliver results. And from my perspective, I'm now on my 3rd local enterprise partnership. Before that, I was spent some time local government, central government. Everywhere I've gone, the first thing I've done is actually build a governance structure that gets everybody engaged in what we're doing, and make sure that any mechanisms that we use are highly transparent, accountable, and that we're working across the public, private, and voluntary and community sector, so that everyone's got a stake in delivering change, but also brings something to the table. So sorry to Jamie, I'm not a big fan of mythical beast leadership. I actually think the greatest things are done by everyone working together and pulling in the same direction. But we do need somebody that catalyses and mobilises that.
Yeah, Joe, that makes a lot of sense. Jamie, picking up on that, really, Rebecca's asked, how this is all very well, everything that we're saying, that we need these voices, we need participation, we need representation, but what do we actually do? What do you do in your area to ensure that those who are experiencing the greatest levels of deprivation are being heard by the decision makers?
Yeah, there's a total misunderstanding about actually the powers that Metro mayors have. Metro mayors have, certainly I have, literally no powers. I don't decide the rules or the laws on anything, not even where the buses go. Some mayors do have more powers. What I have is a budget, a democratic mandate, and convening power. So that speaks to Joe's point. Now, if we look at the governance of the combined authorities, the only person who doesn't get to choose who's in their cabinet, a leader of a local authority does, the Prime Minister does. I have to deal with the leaders of the local authorities. So it's democratic by design. We have so many assurance frameworks. Steve Rotherham was here. We say we're the most scrutinized politicians there are. And he's right. We get these powers out there by working with communities. So we have an inclusive economy board, which is chaired by Bishop Christine Hardman, who's the Bishop of the equivalent North of Tyne area. But there's local businesses on it, and there's the VCSE sector on it, and the TUC on it. Every board I've set up has got trade union representatives on it. We co-designed our Good Work pledge with the business community, with the trade unions. That's how we do it. Because Joe's right, because I can stand here shouting people should do this, people should do that, but they won't do it unless they're involved. And good leaders know that. But what we do need is a local anchor, because when something is set up at the patronage of Whitehall, we've seen it 51 times in the past 40 years. When Whitehall can turn it off, these people will never stand up and say, Whitehall, you need to do things differently. That is why you do need local leaders with a democratic mandate.
Thanks, Jamie. Caroline, can you come in on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree about the collaborative leadership point, but I think it's about being trusted leaders. The thing that really is missing most from our society is the trust that we used to have in each other and for each other. But trust, excuse me, comes from transparency and accountability. And the fact that, you know, the way those systems are set up all feels a little bit, to the average person, it feels like the black box in your car. You know it's there, you know it has a function, but it's completely opaque. You don't understand it. And that's why at the Commission, we're creating, really clear, evidence-based, outcome-focused objectives. Because if we're going to have a real democracy, we need informed people. We need to be able to get local people to understand what it is, what the services will do for them, how they have access to them, how they have a voice. We need to demonstrate all of those things, and we need frameworks that can be publicly transparent, publicly accountable to help us do that. Otherwise, it's just more rhetoric. All we're doing is taking central government and making it a little bit smaller and a little bit more local without changing the experience of it. And that's the thing I would really like to see happening, is much more openness, much more transparency, and much more evidence of people being consulted at the point that a service is being developed or proposed, or a policy proposed, and not later when they've got no choice in the matter.
Thanks, Caroline. Anne-Marie, let me bring you in here.
Yeah, I just want to sort of embellish on what Caroline's already said and talk about the fact that we need deliberative democracy in the North. So when we talk about devolution, and when devolution has been discussed by white men around, you know, strange tables, then the reality is that, like, people on the ground are not hearing how decisions are being made, why they're being made in the way that they're being made. So it's really important that there is a top-down and a bottom-up synergy when it comes to devolution. But it's also about representation as well. So right now in the North, 62% of the North is covered by a combined authority. And as I said before, all of the metro mayors are white males, so no offense, Jamie. But it is important that we have proper representation when it comes to leadership at combined authorities. But it also means that we have mechanisms in place to allow for accountability, to allow for transparency. So right now, when it comes to conversations about devolution, there's few opportunities for citizen participation in some regions in the North. There's few formal mechanisms. There is an increase in popularity around citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies, which I know a lot of combined authorities have considered. I know in the North of Tyne that there has been conversations around citizens' assemblies, and we need to basically have more of those kind of mechanisms where people can actually sit with decision makers and hold them accountable. So it's ultimately about representation and deliberative democracy, having mechanisms in place where people can hold leaders to account, and also feel like they can become leaders as well, you know, so that women of colour feel like they can become councillors, and then eventually that will lead to a pipeline to them achieving more senior positions in councils. So yeah, that was just something I wanted to add on to Caroline's points.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Jimmy.
Thanks. Just to point out that I'm not at all offended you're calling me a white man, it's true, but that Jessie Jacobs is running in Tees Valley, and she's a BAME woman. And in Newcastle City Council, the Labour group has more women than men. The Mayor of North Tyneside, one of the constituency authorities, is Norma Redfern, a woman. They have 50-50 gender balance in their Labour group. We have more female MPs, Labour MPs certainly, in the North of Tyne than men. And the Police and Crime Commissioner is also a woman. So it is almost just a statistical accident that it's aligned around mayors. Women are very well represented, certainly in Labour politics in the North East.
Thanks, Jimmy. We've talked a lot about how we can organise ourselves on a regional level, and we've talked about what really we want from Whitehall. But I want to pick up on something that Joe said earlier, and that's about the role of business. How important are businesses in this levelling up agenda, and what can we do to truly harness their might?
Businesses are going to be critical. And I think one of the things that we've sadly ended up with during the pandemic is a sort of health versus wealth debate, rather than recognising that both systems are absolutely symbiotic. And, you know, we've got to re-establish really, really strong relationships with the business community and set about engaging them. So for me, businesses want to do stuff, for want of a better phrase. They don't want to sit on committees. They don't want to read 1,000-page paper packs. They don't want to discuss conceptual issues. They actually want to be really engaged in some very practical, tangible actions. They want to talk to their peers. So one of the things I talked about, our governance structure. I've got 8 sector panels, 5 strategy boards. I'm leading the Business and Economic Response and Recovery Group for the Local Resilience Forum. That brings together all of our partners to really think about the issues. And they've been extremely active in talking about what the business community needs to manage through COVID, and are now very much moving into what does the business community need to take things forward. And I think some of the time we lose sight of the fact that our wealth, our national wealth, is created by the private sector. The public sector spend money that is basically generated. And I think it's really important they have a stake in this, but they also feel ownership and responsibility. I know Jamie's going to come back on some of this, but they feel ownership and responsibility for helping to drive change and feel part of, we have got a stake in this, we want to make things happen. So really, really critical for me. And it's how do we harness that energy, expertise, agility and pace going forward?
Have we found a bone of contention here? Jamie, you were shaking your head during part of that.
I was, and I agree with Joe absolutely that we want businesses to be involved in this, but I have to challenge it's just not simply economically true that wealth is generated by the private sector and spent by the public sector. We cannot allow that narrative, because that is what has caused this bubble in the City of London, because wealth is not asset prices. Wealth is healthy people, educated people, good public services, the maintenance of law and order, all of these things which the public sector delivers. And when we see it outsourced and tried to run through a profit-making accountability model, it fails drastically. So let's not get into the private sector is our savior here. It has to be a joint endeavor.
Caroline.
Yeah, I'm in danger of getting on my soapbox now. So, but look, obviously it's got to be a private and public sector partnership here, because part of the problem is that the two don't really work together that well. But there are some things that could help. So, businesses are already innovating their way out of problems. They're already planning. They are incredibly capable at survival and thriving. We have to be able to work with them. Jamie was bemoaning the fact that he doesn't have the people who can, work long term on the big strategic issues. There is a real potential for a partnership here. Big business often have volunteering programs. We can pull these things together. We can really work effectively together. But one of the problems is that the way reward is structured for businesses, if one pundit on breakfast television in the morning said, I think let's choose a household brand, BT, who does fabulous stuff on equality and diversity's share price should go up 10p because of that very fact and because they're active in the local community, we would change business behaviour overnight. We would draw out the fact that you can do good by doing business. You don't have to have business here and philanthropy over here. We drive the two together, we forge local relationships, and we get a massive impact rather than division. And just, we talk about intersectionality, but there's also intersectionality in deep in poverty. But we know that when women work, they spend money on their kids. There is a positive intersectionality as well in getting all of this working together. And I feel we have to stop looking at them as private here, public there, and really think about how do we build a structure where all of our economic forces, all of our social forces can come together. And before I step off my soapbox, the last thing is we have to stop measuring everything purely fiscally. And until we can build a measure that is as acceptable as the finance report, everybody gets the finance report. And as a long-suffering HR person, I don't have the equivalent of that. We have to build some really clear social value measurements, and they have to be able to stand up. Then we'll really unite things and we'll really see change. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm very happy for you to get on your soapbox. That made perfect sense to me. I'm going to just move the conversation on a bit to make sure we're reflecting the full range of questions that we're getting. I want to talk about the environment. Jimmy, you mentioned it in your opening words, and there's a number of questions along the lines of how do we ensure the environment isn't sacrificed as we aim to level up?
Yeah. The budget last year, the Chancellor very boldly proclaimed we're spending £1 billion on green transport. The very next sentence was, I quote, and 27 billion on tarmac. So this is what I mean. You can't level up with concrete or tarmac for that matter, and it won't help. It's also not particularly good value for money, a lot of schemes. So it's about embedding it and making sure that you have, what, for want of a better phrase, a Green New Deal. We pulled together a plan that we submitted for the comprehensive spending review that didn't happen, and we're now approaching it for a devolution deal to bring the whole of the North East together, not just the part that I represent, that create 55,000 jobs in basically a mixture of green industries and low impact industries. Now, I think everybody gets that, so I'm not going to develop the point. What I would say is what we also need to be including is the idea that recovery can be about low impact things and must be about low impact things like local festivals, local culture and arts and sport, so that we can actually enjoy ourselves on our day off, because that's one of the best measures of well-being, is not just how much money you've got to buy more expensive kit off Amazon, but actually how much you're interacting with people in your community, and is there a genuine, and we know that things like racism and homophobia, all these things break down when people get to meet. And when they get to have shared experiences. So I think that's a big part of it. Now, all of these things are low carbon. They involve less stuff, less traveling. So I think that's got to be the future model for the economy. How do we embed it? We can either legislate for it, and we can have leaders for it, and we're pulling together leaders, our local LEP, leaders from north and south of the Tyne, all of the big players, to have a net zero task force to see, can we get there way ahead of the government stuff. North of Tyne, our authority is very, very good, but we're a tiny team. We're not the people who have to generate the electricity.
Thanks, Jamie. Joe, there's a very specific question along the same lines for you. Jim wants to know, is there a risk that levelling up in your area may be at the expense and risk of environment and climate concerns? And if so, how do you think the challenge should be addressed?
In terms of Jim's question, the first thing I'd say is that we wrote our Restart, Reboot, Rethink, Recovery plan in August of last year and have been implementing that plan ever since. One of the key things within that, Sinead, was clean energy production. So in terms of Cumbria's economy, we're actually currently a net exporter of electricity by some way. There is an absolute commitment to look at further energy generation opportunities. And in terms of, at the outset, I talked about the 3 touchstones for our economic strategy, inclusive growth, productivity, and net zero and decarbonisation. And genuinely, we're looking at everything that we're doing to say, how do we make that happen? Other themes that we've got, Jamie's touched, we attract 47 million visits per annum through the Lake District and other areas in the county, making that as carbon neutral as possible. How do we make the new visitor experience do that? We're also working with our farming community on the future of food and looking at decarbonising food, bringing in more plant-based. We have phenomenal beef, dairy and sheep farming, but we also want to look at plant-based production, because that will be the way that food will partly change in the future, and we need to respond and react to that. So we take the environment really, really serious, and in our recovery planning, as I say, it's one of the 3 touchstones, and we've got themes that absolutely focus on how do we improve our energy production capability, because in Cumbria, that's the biggest gift that we can give to the nation. We already give more than we consume, and we can take that up to a significantly higher level. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to keep moving on now, and I want to talk a bit about disability. There's a few questions have come in. Amreen, I presume really everything you've said about inclusion and diversity, disability would be a part of that conversation, but it's presumably an extra barrier in the levelling up conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I think I have spoken a lot about gender and race, but there are so many other protected characteristics that we need to consider, especially disabilities. We actually had our International Women's Day event with IPPO North last week, and I learned that 1 in 5 Northern women are disabled, so that's quite a high number. So it's really important that when we think about levelling up, we definitely put disabled people at the centre of the recovery as well. Definitely because of lockdown, because of the pandemic, there's been an increase of social isolation, and that has definitely been felt amongst disabled people too. And as I said before, it is ethnic minority groups and disabled people that will have a harder time finding a job as we recover from the pandemic. So they should, as with all other protected characteristics, disabled people should also definitely be put at the centre of the recovery plan.
Yes, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Caroline, can you come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's lots of evidence that disabled people have had a greater impact because of the pandemic. And just one example is that we've seen lots of disabled people become deconditioned because, perhaps they need access to a swimming pool to keep themselves healthy. They haven't been able to do that. So what we've actually got is a very complex environment of disabled people who are very, very dependent on good local services and provision. So, in order to just even think about work, there are so many things that need to happen. So, we need employers to have a much more flexible and open mind about employing disabled people. We need to have flexibility in, flexible working. Not all disabled people are able to travel to work, and we know now that we can get work to them. So we've got to really think about that. We've got to think about the long-term health. And I think one of the things that's always been a problem for disabled people is that we have this terrible habit of being under ambitious for them. So we talk about careers for most people, and for disabled people we talk about jobs, and that's just not right. Disabled people must have access to long-term careers if they're going to lift themselves out of some of the poverty that they experience and the disadvantage they experience. So, for disabled people, we really need, it's very different depending on whether you're a rural or a city. We really need to have good, strong local voice about what's needed. And we need that to be a conversation that also includes employers, because, there are a lot of misconceptions about disability that we need to deal with.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, Caroline. There's been a question to me about what Channel 4 is doing in this regard, and I'm really pleased to say that Channel 4 is the home of the Paralympics. So we build content towards that great spectacle, hopefully in August of this year, a year late. Last year we have a production trainee scheme every year that gives 15 young people the opportunity to get into the industry. We've got a 94% rate of them getting jobs after that, so we're very proud of it. Last year it was all for disabled applicants. We've got programs like The Last Leg and Rosie Jones' latest series, so we have a very clear inclusion and diversity strategy on screen. Obviously there's always more to do, and off screen we've got employee groups. So we've got a group called For Mind, which is an opportunity for staff to get together to discuss and support through mental health issues, and we've got another one for more broader disabilities, which is For Purple, and obviously it's obviously for allies as well. So that's just an answer to the specific Channel 4 question. Caroline, you also though talked about the reliance that disabled people have on good, you use the word good, services and provision in their areas. Tony has made the point that we still don't have equal access to public transport. He talks about 38% of train stations not being accessible on all platforms. This seems like we're starting from behind the curve if we're talking about levelling up, and something so basic is not the case. Jamie, do you have a view on what we can do to at least get to that sort of benchmark ground level?
There's a particularly big problem with buses, extremely difficult to access if you're disabled, even more so than trains. One of the key things we need to be doing is to make sure that it's just built into the standards, so that it's not people, we don't end up with this situation in future where people say, oh well, but there's an economic cost to replace them. That's just actually, you know, I think it is law actually. I'm not sure why it isn't built in. I mean, obviously we have equalities laws, so why these things aren't necessarily transferred through the standards, that would be it shouldn't require anybody to be good or aware of this. It should just be the law.
It is the law.
And enforced.
So if I can just come in there,
yeah.
I mean, you know, one of the things that mayors can do is really utilise the powers, excuse me, it must be catching Joe, that they have under the Bus Services Act 2017. So it is a fairly recent act, but it gives you real powers to remove any barriers that prevent either disabled people or older people accessing those services.
All mayors apart from me have that power, which is why we're going out for a new Devo deal, so I can get the transport powers and start doing this.
That sounds promising, but it is slightly galling, isn't it, that something so basic is not in place. We're going to do some quick fire ones insofar as we can, because we're reaching the final 10-15 minutes of the session today. Do keep your questions coming in. I'm trying to get through as many as possible. Maureen, I'm going to come to you. Helena has asked that, she says that when she hears the government talking about levelling up the north, she automatically assumes this is about investment from Liverpool to Leeds and that belt across the way. Do you think that is a fair perception?
I think the problem is that there's a lot of different interpretations about what levelling up means, and that's not anyone's fault. That's probably just because of the way that the messaging has been around levelling up for the past 2 years. So in the recent budget, they said that the Levelling Up Fund was a pot of money for all 4 nations. It's an insufficient pot of money, but it is a pot of money, and it is meant to target all regions. It's meant to be something that every local authority has access to. It will be through bidding wars, and yeah, there is a level of competition to that, which is not something that we think is real levelling up. But yeah, I just want to reiterate the point that levelling up, the messaging around it, what it should mean has been really confusing for everyone, for a lot of people. So I think it's really important that there's clarity from the government on what they actually mean by what levelling up is, and also carry out levelling up to a scale that actually matches to the challenges that we have, especially as we're coming out from the pandemic. For sure, but just for clarity, even though it seems like it is for certain parts, it is technically meant to be for all four nations.
Joe,
to some extent, given the argument that I've been running that we should be focused on the entirety of expenditure, not specific component parts, for me, levelling up needs to be in situ. And it needs to be tackling the issues that get in the way of equality and fairness. So, for instance, I've talked about some bits of our geography. One area within Cumbria has got the 3rd highest weekly wages in the country. Yet there are people, if you look at workless families, there's a higher than national average level of workless families. In that geography, the task is to change that. So for me, it's very much in situ, and each place really needs to understand its place and the issues that need to be resolved, because it's not fair that those things happen. So for me, it's getting down into the specifics of geography. And whilst there may be a national model of levelling up with all of the metrics, with funding and policy attached, for me, in our own geographies, we need to understand what the levelling up issues are and develop strategies and interventions that help to address those things.
Jamie, just picking up what Joe said, have we created an unhelpful shorthand by talking about levelling up in the north?
Yeah, Amarine was saying we're not really sure what levelling up means. We're also not really sure what the north means. You know, if you live in Newcastle, then Manchester is a long, long way south. And I often rib Andy Burnham about this. He says if he's the king of the north, that makes me the king of the wildlings because I'm north of Hadrian's Wall. So the reality is that even if you live in parts of London, even if you can see Canary Wharf Tower, it does not mean that you share in any of the wealth from it. So that's what we've got to talk about. And frankly, my agenda is one of economic democracy. Now, I represent a place in the north, so that's where it is. And we do have bigger disadvantages. It's another one of those barriers I talked about. But yeah, this has got to be a national and crucially a global project.
Thanks, Jamie. I'd like to go to a question now from Amanda, and I'm going to ask Caroline your view on this. Amanda says the new Children's Commissioner has announced a once-in-a-generation beverage report for children. What do you think the priorities of this review should be for young people in the north?
Big question. I mean, I think, you know, you have to look at the entire life course of the child, to be honest. So we have to think about, you know, prenatal health, because that's a big determinant of how children progress in life. Then we have to think about what is their experience of early learning. How do we do that? Then we know that each of these steps has a big impact, if we get it right, a big positive impact on how the child progresses to the next stage. So we know good experience, preschool, leads to better experience and better educational attainment in the education system throughout. Also, having very active and involved parents is important, and having safeguards that are joined up when things go wrong, so that we have you know, a holistic view working at the family level and working for the benefit of the child. So it is a combination of so many things. And one of the things that we're not always great at in this country is really joined up policy, joined up services. So really thinking about how do we do that? How do we think about the child holistically and within the family and the local setting? And I think, you know, right now when we have millions and millions of children who are living in poverty, and actually through the pandemic have been pushed into deeper poverty, the sort of poverty that can take generations to get out of, we've really got to think about how do we create the kind of economic democracy that Jamie's talking about. So we've got to get really in close and understand what the steps are for a child, what makes a good life, a life that's really worth living, what gives them lots of life choices. But we've also got to understand where the big contextual barriers like poverty kick in and what we do about those.
Thank you, Caroline. And we're coming to the end of our session. Thank you very much for all the questions you sent. And I'm sorry if we didn't get them all, but I hope you'll agree that it was a wide-ranging discussion. There's clearly an awful lot to do here, not least in clarifying what is meant by the intention to level up, clarifying the role, the tension between devolution and centralisation, and importantly, moving it on from a conversation or a wish list to tangible action that can see real benefits in the lives of the people in our communities. I'd like to thank our panelists today, Mayor Jamie Driscoll, Caroline Waters, Joe Lappin and Amreen Qureshi. I'd like to thank IPPR events team for having us and ensuring that, bar the odd little glitch, that everything worked well. And I'd like to thank Ailish, the stenographer, for beautifully ensuring that the session has been captioned for our audience. Thank you for everything. See you all soon. Have a great day.